I'll begin by talking about the basic way that a belt works. The basic belt, the grit or the grain size, the smaller the number. In the US, we typically see grinding belts starting around 36 to 40 and progressing up to as high as 1,000. To complicate things, Japan and Europe use different numbering systems that are similar but not quite the same as the US. Another complicating factor, in some cases high grit belts are often expressed in microns, in which case the smaller the number, the smaller the grit. This is done specifically to confuse you. The main types of abrasives found on belts are aluminum oxide, often called AO, silicon carbide, zirconia, and various forms of ceramics. Abrasives are coated onto belts of various stiffnesses and thicknesses. The standard terminology for belt stiffness is alphabetic, with the stiffness and thickness of the belt increasing toward the end of the alphabet. Commonly seen belts are J, X, and Y weight. To further complicate things, belts can be subjected to treatment. In this case, the J flex is the same thickness as a standard J weight, but it's more flexible. These more flexible belts are particularly useful for creating soft plunge lines, hollow grind transitions, and other tricky tricks. The basic process in all grinding is to start with a low grit belt, generally 36, 40, 60, somewhere in that range, and to do your rough grinding almost entirely with that belt. In other words, 90% of the metal you remove will be done with that one belt, your lowest grit belt. And what's that mean in practical terms? It means that most of your wear is going to be on your heaviest grit belts. So whatever grit you normally start with, you'll probably use way more of those belts than any of your higher grit belts. However, there's a complicating factor again, there always is. High grit belts wear out and load up much quicker than lower grit belts. The layer of abrasives is thinner, so it loads up with crud or just plain wears out faster, whereas steel just tends to wreck the abrasives. Either way, at some point, the belt stops cutting very well and you have to replace it. So when is that moment? Well, it's just a question of how much you value your time. The moment you start using a normal belt, its performance falls off. It takes more work, more time, more pressure to cut the same amount of material, and the finish will change slightly as the belt wears away. So, when you decide, okay, screw it, this is taking way too long, that's the moment you have to toss the belt. And how long is that? Well, in my experience, you can make a couple of knives with a budget level 60 grit aluminum oxide belt before it's toast. On the other hand, a 40 grit ceramic belt might bust through 10, 15, maybe even more knives before it runs out of gas. Of course, it depends on the size of the knives, the type of steel, and so on. But that's a very rough guide. In other words, you probably get 5 to 10 times as much use out of a ceramic belt than out of aluminum oxide. On the other hand, they cost 3 times as much. So the math still works out in favor of ceramic, but just recognize that wear down exposing more abrasives or with impregnated material. Either way, structured abrasives don't wear out the way normal belts do. They just keep on trucking until suddenly they stop working entirely. So they last quite a long time and give you this. So they're no good for roughing, but they're great for certain types of finishing operations. They also don't bounce at the joints, so they can be well controlled to give you neat, clean grind lines. Now look, there are more kinds of abrasives than I just mentioned here, but there's no reason to go too nuts if you're just getting started. We've already gone pretty deep into the weeds, so let's stop here before we get stuck. Enough already. Bottom
Units arrive ready to use with 10 grinding belts, tool rest, and eye shield, and your investment is protected by a 5-year warranty on the motor. Available models feature 3 to 6 inch wide top-mounted deburring and polishing surfaces and contact wheels from 8 by 3 inches to 8 by 6. Driven by powerful 4-horsepower motors, all models feature built-in motor protection and low operating noise levels. You'll hear no chatter.
Cambia. Qué hermoso, boludo, como queda. Muéstramelo acá. Qué aparato.